I'm Cody Root, and this is the Church of Logic. Last time we talked about ordinals. We explained kind of what they were. They're a totally ordered set where the order is well-founded, which is to say there are no infinite decreasing sequences. I gave this kind of analogy where, the Grim Reaper is coming down to catch you, and they're climbing down a ladder, like rungs of a ladder. And an ordinal is kind of like the ladder, right? And say if there's an infinite number of rungs, in this analogy, the Grim Reaper asks you which rung it should go to. And you have an incentive to say a big one, right? And then I explained how you can sort of add ordinals together by piling these ladders on top of each other. And I even explained that if you have this kind of infinite number of ladders with infinite rungs, there's this situation where, the Reaper has to ask you which part of the ladder it goes to first. And then for each ladder it hits after that, which, it can be arbitrarily large, it has to ask you each time which rung to go to. And I explained that was, the ordinal omega plus the ordinal omega, and that this addition occurred an infinite number of times. Now, omega plus omega plus omega infinite number of times, right? Morally, you could see this as kind of an infinite ladder where each rung itself is an infinite ladder, right? So it's omega where each element of omega is an omega itself. And it turns out, and this is kind of cool, that this can be seen as a multiplication of ordinals, right? Omega times omega. Each ordinal, if you imagine it as this kind of crazy fractal ladder, and you zoom into each rung, if you replace the rung itself by another ordinal, right, this is exactly what ordinal multiplication is, right? You take the first ordinal and you replace each step of that ordinal by another ordinal. And so I've defined addition, I've defined multiplication. It might not be too surprising to realize we can define other operations like exponentiation and some even more complex operations. I'm not going to explain those too much, at least for now. But it's really cool that we can do this. We can do all these operations. We can do arithmetic, and the arithmetic has some familiar rules and it has some unfamiliar rules, right? It's not commutative, but it's associative. You can distribute over, if you have an ordinal a times b plus c, that you can distribute the a, and it's a times b plus a times c. So you have all these cool rules, and yeah, it's exciting to examine these rules and to understand what they're for. The practical applications of this, I think, are mostly theoretical, but there are applications of thinking about ordinals. There are ways to take these infinite sets with these subtle operations and try to apply them to situations that that we care about, and usually those situations are finite. One obvious application is if you can associate an ordinal with, say, a program state. You're writing a program and maybe some inputs are unknown, or maybe there's a state of the world that you can't control. But if you can associate every possible state of your program with an ordinal, and if you can show that a computational step will bring you to a smaller ordinal, then you don't necessarily know how long that program is going to run, but you do know that that program is going to run for a finite amount of time, right? And in some sense, every program that runs for a finite amount of time necessarily can be turned into an ordinal in this way. There's always an ordinal that sort of represents how much effort it's going to take for that program to terminate, right? And of course, if you know all the inputs and you know all the states, that ordinal is just a finite number, right? It's just, it might take 10 billion steps, or it might take 100 billion steps, or it might take 5 steps. But because you know everything, you know how many steps it's going to take. But if there's any non-determinism, if there's any open-endedness to how the program execution goes, Well, now you don't know exactly how many steps. It's the analogy of this game where at some point, there's going to be a choice, and that choice is not necessarily in your control, right? Um, and now we're playing the role of the Grim Reaper, right? Now it's us that is trying to get this program to terminate, and at some points, there are things outside of our control. But if you can associate those things to an ordinal, then despite being outside of your control, you know that they're eventually going to be finite. And so in the realm of program analysis, you can use ordinals, and you can use them to say, oh, this program is actually always going to terminate, or something that needs to happen eventually is always going to happen. Now, arguably, it's not always that useful to know something is going to happen if that thing takes more than the age of the universe. But again, arguing in the other direction, knowing that it's going to happen eventually is usually a very good sign, right? It usually means you've gotten it right, right? If you can prove that, you can associate this ordinal, your program is eventually going to terminate. Usually you've gone a long way to know that this program actually does what you want it to do. Because it's very easy to get things wrong, and this sort of says, oh, you haven't gotten everything wrong. It's eventually going to terminate. So I think people use often ordinals in this context to sort of like try to prove something about a program in this idealized world where it doesn't really matter how long it takes to terminate, it just matters that it does. And there's this kind of deeper connection with program termination that comes through the form of logic, right? You're trying to understand logics. You're trying to understand, pan-arithmetic, set theory, which I'm going to talk about later. You're trying to understand whether you should believe in these logic, whether they're consistent or not. We've shown with, with the incompleteness theorems that there's some sense in which you can't know these things, right? There's some absolute unknowables, but really interesting application of ordinal theory is that you can associate ordinals to logical theories in a certain way. I'm not going to explain this right now, but I'm going to explain the basic idea, which is, in some sense, you look at those proofs in these systems, you associate ordinals with these proofs, right? And then what's cool is that any two different ordinals can be compared, right? In the same way that two elements of an ordinal can be compared, any two different ordinals can be compared. Essentially, an ordinal is bigger than another if if it takes longer for the Grim Reaper, if it requires more choices to eventually terminate if you're a decreasing sequence. All right, so now if you associate two different ordinals to two different logical theories, you can compare the strength of those logical theories. And also philosophically, you can ask yourself, okay, is this ordinal something that seems reasonable to me or not, right? And in particular, you can show this result where, okay, this logical theory is consistent, right? It doesn't prove false if and only if this thing that I've said is an ordinal is actually an ordinal. If it's actually the case that you can't have these infinitely decreasing sequences in this ordinal. And so now you can sort of ask your intuition, right? You can say, do I believe that this thing is actually an ordinal, or don't I? And if I do, then at least philosophically, I've come up with this really powerful argument for consistency. Because here it is, right? Here's an object that I can stare at and try and understand with my intuition whether or not it terminates. And then if you can compare different theories, you can sort of see where they're placed along the lines of your belief, right? Is this ordinal much simpler than this other ordinal? These are combinatorial objects. And so mathematicians, of course, they love thinking about numbers and objects like this that are very concrete rather than abstract notions of provability or function spaces. So here the connection with logic emerges, and we see that there's this really powerful connection between these objects and the things we want to believe about logic and truth. So this is a really exciting subject, and I'm probably going to talk about it quite a bit more in the future. Until then, take care, everyone.